To understand why avoidants cannot forget the person who finally rejected them completely, we first have to understand something that is often misunderstood about avoidant attachment itself. Most people look at an avoidant and see someone who does not care. Someone who is emotionally detached, self-sufficient, and unaffected by relationships. They see the distance, the independence, the reluctance to open up, and they assume there is simply less feeling there. But psychology tells us something very different. Avoidant attachment is not the absence of emotional needs. It is a strategy for managing emotional needs. That distinction changes everything. Human beings are wired for connection. The need to bond, to belong, to feel seen and understood is not a personality preference. It is part of our biological design. Even the most fiercely independent person carries this need somewhere beneath the surface. Avoidants are no exception. What makes avoidants different is not that they lack attachment. It is that they learned, often very early in life, that attachment feels risky. At some point, whether through inconsistency, rejection, emotional neglect, or experiences that taught them vulnerability was unsafe, they developed a solution. Instead of eliminating their need for connection, which is impossible, they learned to suppress their awareness of it. They became experts at emotional self-containment. And this is where many people become confused. Because when an avoidant creates distance, they often look calm, they appear rational, they seem unaffected. They may move on quickly, focus on work, pursue goals, or immerse themselves in distractions. To the outside world, it can seem as though they have transcended emotional dependence altogether. But appearance and reality are not the same thing. The avoidance emotional system does not stop operating simply because it is hidden from view. Think of it like pressure beneath the surface of the ocean. Just because the water appears calm does not mean powerful forces are not moving underneath. In many cases, avoidants experience emotions intensely. The difference is that they have trained themselves not to stay with those emotions for very long. They disconnect from them. They intellectualize them. They redirect their attention elsewhere. Distance becomes regulation. Control becomes safety. The philosophy underlying this pattern is simple. If I do not depend too much on anyone, then no one can truly hurt me. And for a while, this strategy works. The avoidant maintains a sense of autonomy. Relationships can exist, but only within boundaries that feel manageable. Closeness is permitted, but only to a certain point. Vulnerability is allowed, but only in carefully measured amounts. What matters most is that the avoidant feels they can step back whenever necessary. They need the door to remain open, not because they are always planning to leave, but because knowing they can leave helps them feel secure enough to stay. This is why emotional distance often becomes such a central feature of avoidant behavior. It is not merely a preference. It is a protective mechanism. It is a way of regulating anxiety while preserving a sense of personal freedom. Yet hidden within that strategy is a profound contradiction. The avoidant wants connection, but fears dependence. They want intimacy, but fear vulnerability. They want to be understood, but fear being exposed. And so they spend much of their lives balancing between these opposing desires, moving closer and then pulling away, seeking connection while simultaneously protecting themselves from it. Understanding this tension is essential because it reveals a truth many people miss. The avoidance attachment system never disappears. It simply operates behind layers of defense. And when those defenses are functioning, life feels predictable. The emotional distance creates a sense of stability. The avoidant believes they are managing relationships on their own terms. But the entire system depends on one crucial condition. It depends on the belief that distance remains a choice. The moment that choice is taken away, something profound begins to shift. Because what appears to be emotional detachment is often emotional management. And when the ability to manage distance is challenged, the feelings that were kept beneath the surface can no longer remain hidden. That is where the story truly begins. Because the avoidant's deepest struggle is not learning how to leave. It is discovering what happens when someone leaves them first. Now, once we understand that avoidant attachment is fundamentally a strategy of emotional management rather than emotional absence, we can begin to see why complete rejection affects an avoidance in a way that often surprises both them and the people around them. Because the entire avoidance system is built on a silent assumption. I may not always choose closeness, but I can choose distance whenever I need to. That assumption creates a sense of psychological safety. For most avoidants, emotional regulation is deeply connected to autonomy. They feel secure not necessarily because they are disconnected, but because they believe they retain the freedom to control the level of connection. They can move closer when it feels comfortable and step back when vulnerability becomes overwhelming. Whether consciously or unconsciously, they experience relationships through the lens of choice. And choice is power. This is why many avoidants can remain relatively calm during situations that create intense anxiety for others. The possibility of withdrawal remains available. The exit door remains unlocked. Even if they never use it, knowing it exists provides emotional reassurance. But something entirely different happens when another person closes that door permanently. When someone finally says, "No more, I'm done. I'm moving forward without you." The psychological landscape changes. The avoidant is no longer navigating distance by choice. Distance has been imposed upon them. And human beings respond very differently to a loss we choose versus a loss that is chosen for us. Philosophers have discussed this distinction for centuries. Freedom is not merely about what we possess. It is about what remains possible. The moment a possibility disappears forever, its psychological significance often grows. Think about how often people take opportunities for granted until those opportunities no longer exist. A city feels ordinary until you leave it. A friendship feels secure until it ends. A relationship feels available until access is permanently removed. The avoidant experiences a similar phenomenon, but often with greater intensity because their emotional defenses were built around maintaining control over proximity and self-distance. When that control disappears, something unexpected occurs. The protective structure begins to crack. Many avoidants spend years believing that what troubles them is too much closeness. Yet when complete rejection occurs, they discover that what truly unsettles them is not intimacy itself. It is powerlessness. For perhaps the first time, they encounter a relationship outcome they cannot manage through withdrawal. They cannot create distance because distance has already been created. They cannot regain emotional equilibrium through detachment because the detachment was not their decision. And suddenly emotions that were previously muted begin to emerge. Not because the rejection created those feelings, because the rejection exposed them. This is one of the great paradoxes of avoidant attachment. The person who leaves often becomes more psychologically significant than the people who stayed, not necessarily because they were loved more, not necessarily because their relationship was healthier, but because they disrupted the avoidant's normal system of emotional control. What the avoidant loses is not only the person, they lose authorship of the story. And human beings are deeply attached to the narratives they create about themselves. Many avoidants unconsciously construct an identity around self-sufficiency. They see themselves as the ones who decide when relationships progress, when they pause, and when they end. Their autonomy becomes part of how they understand themselves. Then someone enters their life who refuses to play that role. Someone who reaches a point where they no longer wait, no longer pursue, no longer negotiate, no longer leave the door open. And suddenly the avoidant is confronted with an unfamiliar reality. There are some losses that cannot be controlled. There are some endings that cannot be reversed. There are some people who do not remain available indefinitely. This realization strikes at a much deeper level than simple heartbreak. It challenges an entire worldview, because beneath every avoidant defense is a belief that emotional safety comes from maintaining enough distance to stay in control. Complete rejection exposes the limitation of that belief. It reveals that control can never fully protect us from loss. No amount of distance can eliminate the vulnerability inherent in caring about another human being. And this is why the memory often persists. Not because the avoidant suddenly becomes obsessed with the person, but because the experience represents something larger than the relationship itself. It is the moment their familiar strategy encounters its boundary. The moment they discover that independence cannot prevent every wound. The moment they realize that emotional control and emotional immunity are not the same thing. And when a person confronts the limits of a lifelong defense, they rarely forget the experience that revealed it. Because the deepest losses are not always the ones that break our hearts. Often they are the ones that shatter our illusions. Once that illusion of control begins to crack, something even more significant starts to happen. The avoidant is no longer just dealing with the loss of a relationship. They are confronting themselves. And this is where the experience often becomes unforgettable. Because every human being carries a story about who they are. We all develop internal narratives that help us make sense of our lives. These narratives become psychological anchors. They provide stability, predictability, and a sense of identity. For the avoidant, one of the most common narratives revolves around self-sufficiency. I don't need much from other people. I'm fine on my own. I can handle things myself. I don't get attached the way other people do. These beliefs are not necessarily conscious. Often they operate beneath awareness, shaping perceptions and decisions without being openly acknowledged. Over time, they become part of the avoidance identity. And identity is powerful. In many ways, people fight harder to protect their identity than they do to protect their relationships. Because when a relationship ends, it hurts. But when an identity is challenged, it destabilizes the way we understand ourselves. This is why complete rejection affects avoidance so deeply. The rejection creates a collision between two realities. On one side is the story they have been telling themselves for years. On the other side is the emotional experience they cannot fully explain away. If they truly do not need anyone, why does this loss continue to occupy their thoughts? If they are completely unaffected by attachment, why does this person's absence still matter? If independence is enough, why does the ending feel incomplete? These questions create what psychologists call cognitive dissonance, the mental discomfort that arises when beliefs and experiences contradict one another. And cognitive dissonance is incredibly difficult to ignore. The mind naturally seeks consistency. We want our actions, emotions, and beliefs to fit together in a coherent narrative. When they do not, tension emerges. Most people respond by changing either the belief or the interpretation of the experience. Avoidants often attempt the second option first. They rationalize, they intellectualize, they explain. Maybe the relationship was wrong. Maybe the timing was bad. Maybe they simply missed the familiarity. Maybe it was only their ego. And sometimes those explanations contain elements of truth, but there is often another truth operating beneath them. The rejection matters because the connection mattered. And that realization can be profoundly unsettling. Not because caring is weakness, but because acknowledging how much they cared requires abandoning a protective story that may have guided them for years. Philosophically, this is one of the most difficult tasks any person faces. The philosopher Soren Kierkegaard argued that much of human suffering comes not from reality itself, but from the gap between reality and the stories we tell ourselves about reality. The avoidant often discovers this firsthand. The rejection forces them into contact with aspects of themselves they had previously kept at a distance. Needs they minimized, vulnerabilities they dismissed, emotions they postponed, desires they never fully admitted. What makes this process particularly challenging is that avoidants are often highly skilled at avoiding external vulnerability, but not necessarily prepared for internal confrontation. When someone leaves completely, there is nowhere left to direct attention except inward, and what they find there is frequently surprising. They may discover that beneath the desire for freedom was a desire for connection. Beneath the fear of dependence was a longing to be understood. Beneath the confidence of self-sufficiency was a very human need to matter to someone. This does not mean the avoidant suddenly transforms into a different person, nor does it mean every avoidant experiences this process in exactly the same way. But it does mean that complete rejection can function like a mirror that reflects parts of the self that were previously hidden behind layers of defense. And mirrors can be uncomfortable, because they show us what is there, not what we wish were there. This is one reason the person who finally rejects the avoidant often remains psychologically significant long after the relationship ends. That person becomes associated with a moment of self-discovery, a moment when long-standing assumptions were challenged, a moment when identity and reality collided. The memory persists because it represents more than heartbreak. It represents revelation. The avoidant is not merely remembering a person. They are remembering the version of themselves that was exposed in that person's absence. And few experiences leave a deeper mark on the human psyche than being forced to confront a truth about ourselves that we spent years trying not to see. Because the most powerful rejection is not the one that makes us question another person's feelings. It is the one that makes us question our own story. Once a person begins questioning the story they have been telling themselves, another process inevitably follows. They begin revisiting the past. Not necessarily because they want to, not necessarily because they consciously choose to, but because the human mind has a remarkable tendency. It seeks resolution. When something feels unfinished, the mind keeps returning to it. This is true for everyone, but it becomes especially important when we examine avoidant attachment. One of the defining characteristics of avoidant coping is not that emotions disappear. It is that emotions are often postponed. When discomfort arises, the avoidant frequently directs attention elsewhere. They focus on work, responsibilities, goals, routines, distractions, intellectual explanations, anything that helps create distance from emotional intensity. And in the short term, this strategy can be highly effective. The problem is that emotions do not operate according to the same rules as tasks. A task can be ignored and eventually forgotten. An unresolved emotional experience often cannot. Psychologists have long observed what is known as the Zeigarnik effect, the tendency for unfinished experiences to remain more active in memory than completed ones. The mind is naturally drawn toward what remains unresolved. It keeps searching for understanding, for closure, for completion. And when an avoidant experiences complete rejection, they often find themselves confronting exactly this problem. Because many avoidants leave important emotional experiences partially processed. Conversations remain unfinished. Feelings remain unspoken. Needs remain unacknowledged. Questions remain unanswered. They may leave relationships before fully exploring their own emotions. They may suppress conflicts rather than work through them. They may create distance at the very moment deeper understanding becomes possible. Then the relationship ends. And suddenly there is no longer an opportunity to finish what was left incomplete. No more conversations. No more explanations. No more chances to clarify misunderstandings. No more opportunities to discover what might have happened had they responded differently. The story freezes exactly where it stopped. And frozen stories have a unique power over the human mind. Because certainty allows us to move forward. Uncertainty keeps us looking backward. This is why many avoidants find themselves thinking about the person who rejected them long after the relationship has ended. Not necessarily because they want the relationship back. Not necessarily because they believe reconciliation is possible. But because their minds continue searching for answers that no longer exist. What did that person truly feel? What would have happened if I had opened up more? Did I leave too much unsaid? Could things have been different? These questions become psychological loops. And unlike practical problems, emotional questions rarely yield definitive answers. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche once observed that human beings often suffer less from pain itself than from the inability to find meaning within it. The avoidant frequently encounters this dilemma. The rejection hurts, but what often hurts more is the lack of resolution surrounding the rejection. The absence of a clear ending. The absence of a complete understanding. The absence of certainty. Because certainty, even painful certainty, allows emotional processing to move forward. Ambiguity keeps it suspended. And avoidance, by its very nature, tends to generate ambiguity. Feelings are felt but not expressed. Thoughts are experienced but not shared. Connections are formed but not fully explored. As a result, when the relationship finally ends, there is often far more psychological material left unresolved than either person realizes. The avoidant may have spent months or years suppressing emotions that were never truly addressed. Then complete rejection removes any possibility of future resolution. And what cannot be resolved externally often continues internally. This is one reason avoidants can appear detached immediately after a breakup, only to struggle much later. The emotional processing that was delayed begins demanding attention. What was postponed begins resurfacing. What was avoided begins seeking acknowledgement. In many cases, the person who rejected them becomes a symbol of everything left unfinished. Not just the relationship itself, the words that were never spoken, the affection that was never fully expressed, the vulnerability that was never fully risked, the questions that will never receive answers. And human beings have a difficult time forgetting experiences that remain psychologically incomplete. Completion creates peace. Incompletion creates persistence. The mind returns again and again, searching for a conclusion that reality may never provide. Which leads us to an important realization. The avoidant is often haunted less by what happened than by what never happened. Less by the relationship they had than by the relationship they never fully allowed themselves to experience. Because the memories that linger the longest are rarely those that reach their natural conclusion. They are the ones that ended while part of us was still waiting for the story to continue. And when a story ends before the mind feels it is complete, something fascinating begins to happen. The memory starts to change. Not the facts necessarily, but the meaning attached to them. This is where we encounter one of the most powerful psychological forces in human experience, idealization. Because human beings do not remember the past objectively. We reconstruct it. We revisit it. We reinterpret it. And often, when something becomes permanently unavailable, its value in our minds begins to increase. This tendency is not unique to avoidance. It is part of human nature. What is rare often appears more valuable than what is common. What is difficult to obtain often feels more desirable than what is easily accessible. And what is lost forever often occupies a larger place in memory than what remained available. But for avoidance, this process can become especially intense. Why? Because avoidance frequently feels safest when emotional closeness is still optional. As long as a relationship exists, even imperfectly, They can regulate their anxiety through distance. They can move closer when they choose and pull back when they feel overwhelmed. The relationship remains part of reality, and reality tends to balance perception. Reality has imperfections. Reality includes misunderstandings. Reality includes ordinary moments, frustrations, and limitations. But once the person is gone completely, reality begins to lose its influence, and imagination takes over. The person who rejected them is no longer encountered as they actually are. Instead, they are encountered through memory, and memory is selective. The mind naturally edits. It highlights certain moments while minimizing others. It amplifies emotional significance while reducing complexity. Over time, the rejected person can become less of a human being and more of a symbol of connection, a symbol of possibility, a symbol of what might have been. This transformation is important because symbols carry far greater psychological weight than ordinary people. An ordinary relationship can be evaluated. A symbol is harder to let go of. The avoidant may begin revisiting moments that once seemed insignificant. A conversation, a glance, a shared experience, a moment of vulnerability. Things that were barely noticed at the time suddenly acquire enormous emotional meaning. Why? Because the mind is no longer examining the relationship itself. It is examining the loss. And loss has a way of magnifying value. Psychologically, this is closely connected to what behavioral economists call loss aversion. Research consistently shows that human beings experience the pain of losing something more intensely than the pleasure of possessing it. We often appreciate things most fully only after they disappear. For the avoidant, complete rejection creates exactly this dynamic. The person who once felt available is now unavailable. The possibility that once existed is now gone. And because the possibility is gone, the mind begins assigning greater importance to it. What makes this even more powerful is that the rejected avoidant is often forced to confront emotions that were never fully experienced during the relationship itself. When the relationship was active, defensive strategies may have limited emotional awareness. Distance diluted intensity, withdrawal interrupted reflection, avoidance postponed feeling. But once the relationship ends permanently, those defenses often become less effective, and the emotions that were once muted begin to surface. The avoidant may then mistakenly conclude that the relationship was more extraordinary than it actually was. In reality, they may simply be experiencing emotions that were delayed. The intensity feels new, but the feelings were there all along. This is why some avoidants become preoccupied with the person who left, even when they were the ones creating distance during the relationship. From the outside, it appears contradictory. How can someone push another person away and then struggle to forget them? The answer lies in timing. The emotional experience often arrives after the opportunity has disappeared. What could have been felt gradually during the relationship arrives all at once after its conclusion. And because it arrives alongside permanent loss, it becomes fused with idealization. The rejected person begins representing more than themselves. They become the embodiment of unrealized possibilities, the life that might have unfolded, the intimacy that might have deepened, the version of the relationship that never had the chance to exist. This is why the memory persists. Not because the relationship was perfect. No relationship is. Not because the other person was flawless. No human being is. The memory persists because the mind often turns permanent absence into symbolic significance. And symbols are remarkably difficult to release, especially when they become connected to unanswered questions, unresolved emotions, and unexplored futures. What the avoidant ultimately struggles to forget is not merely the person who left. It is the possibility that left with them. Because people can be replaced. Experiences can be repeated. But the future we once imagined with someone exists only once. And when it disappears forever, it can become far more powerful in memory than it ever was in reality. And that is one of the deepest truths about loss. We do not always grieve what was. Sometimes we grieve what could have been. And ultimately, this brings us to the deepest layer of the entire experience. Because beneath the loss of control, beneath the challenge to identity, beneath the unresolved emotions and the idealization of what might have been, there is something even more profound taking place. The avoidant is not simply grieving the loss of another person. They are grieving the loss of a version of themselves. This is why the person who finally rejects them completely often becomes impossible to forget. Not because that person was necessarily their soulmate, not because the relationship was necessarily the greatest love of their life, but because that person managed to reach a place few others ever reached. They got past the defenses. They got past the distance. They got past the carefully constructed barriers that had protected the avoidant for years. And even if the avoidant never fully acknowledged it at the time, Something important was happening. A different possibility was emerging. For perhaps the first time in a long time, they were not simply managing connection. They were beginning to experience it. Now, this does not mean the avoidant suddenly became emotionally open or completely transformed. Human change is rarely that dramatic. More often what happens is subtle. A little more honesty. A little more trust. A little more vulnerability. A little more willingness to imagine a future that includes another person. Small steps from the outside, but psychologically enormous steps from the inside. Because for someone whose entire attachment system has been organized around protection, every movement toward genuine intimacy represents a significant act of courage. The tragedy is that many avoidants only recognize the significance of those movements after such. The relationship is gone. While the connection exists, their attention is often focused on managing discomfort, maintaining independence, protecting autonomy, creating enough distance to feel safe. But once the person leaves permanently, perspective changes, and suddenly they can see things they could not see before. They begin to recognize moments when they could have spoken but remained silent, moments when they could have stayed present but withdrew, moments when they could have risked vulnerability but chose safety instead. This realization creates a very particular kind of grief, because the pain is no longer centered entirely on the loss of the other person. It becomes intertwined with the loss of unrealized personal growth. The philosopher Martin Heidegger argued that one of the defining features of human existence is that we are always living in relation to possibilities. We are not only who we are also who we might become. And few experiences make us aware of lost possibilities more powerfully than the ending of a meaningful relationship. The avoidant often discovers that the person who left was connected to a future version of themselves, a version that was more emotionally available, more courageous, more open, more willing to trust, more willing to love without constantly retreating into self-protection.